Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen is the Alan and Joe Bildner Visiting Scholar at the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. He is also the Rabbi Edward Sandrau Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he holds a dual appointment in the Department of Jewish History and in the Department of General History. Professor Dekel-Chen served from 2007 to 2019 as the academic chairman, of the Leonid Znevzlin Research Center for Russian and East European Jewry. He is currently chairman of the Russian Studies Department. His publications have appeared in many prestigious scholarly presses, ranging from his focus on Eastern Europe to his interest in global agriculturalism. His current research and publications deal with transnational philanthropy and advocacy, non-state diplomacy, agrarian history, and migration. In 2014, he co-founded the Bikurim Youth Village for the performing arts in Eshkol, which provides world-class artistic training for underserved high school students, very deserving underserved high school students from throughout Israel, but primarily the South. And I'm so delighted to have Professor Dekel-Chen with us for another year. The person who has been his aide-de-camp throughout this process is Jackie Hankard. Jackie is the Jean Hoffman intern at the Bildner Center, and she is currently an MA student at Rutgers in the United Nations and Global Policy Program. She's a 2020 graduate of the College of New Jersey, where she received her bachelor's degree in communications and mass media with a minor in political science. Jackie also contributed to the development of Anne Frank LA, a digital site that aims to promote the legacy of Anne Frank through educational and cultural programs. And you'll be hearing from both of them today, and this digital exhibit is really the fruit of their collaboration with the support, as I said, of the libraries and the staff at the Bildner Center. So thank you so much for coming today. And I welcome Jonathan Dekel-Chen to the digital screen.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tinkoff. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Greetings, or good afternoon to the Rutgers community. Good evening here in Israel. This digital exhibit, Jewish Agriculturalism in the Garden State, I think is a kind of visual celebration of a part of Jewish life that for the vast majority of the Jewish community has been almost entirely forgotten. Yet farming amongst Jews is one of those historical gems that's gotten buried in the fog of time and memory. But like any gem, that story of Jewish farming, has many facets. And I believe, and much of my work is, and certainly the digital exhibit, is designed to show that the further you dig down into that gem, the more fascinating and sparkling it becomes. We hope that the exhibit, because of its digital platform, can help clear that fog of memory for as many people as possible. For others, the exhibit can reveal an entirely new and surprising part of Jewish history and the histories of the communities wherever they live, be it in New Jersey or elsewhere around the globe. We didn't intend, nor have we, constructed a comprehensive encyclopedic recounting of all Jewish farming, even in New Jersey. That's just not possible. Rather, it's an attempt to bring together in a digital way, on one easily accessible platform, the outline of what is in fact global history, with New Jersey at the center of the exhibit. Taken together, although many of you may not know in the audience, from the late 19th and through the first half of the 20th century, approximately 8% of all Jews living farmed the land in hundreds of Jewish colonies that sat on millions of acres on 4 continents. Until now, these pieces of history have been mostly forgotten or told in separation from each other in individual diasporic or other communities, often in languages other than English. So clearly it wasn't inaccessible to many, many people. But this is a story with a truly global spread. We can get a sense of that from the index on the exhibit. And Jackie, please go here to a random page on the exhibit. And you see on the right side of the page, And these are the major subjects that are covered by the exhibit, and Jackie, a little later, will be walking the attendees through how this is all constructed. Now, for those of you who have more specific interests that weren't answered within the exhibit, at the end of the exhibit, there is a suggested reading list, quite comprehensive, where you can choose materials to seek out in your library or online that will give you a lot of information, almost entirely in English, on any of these chapters in Jewish history that you'd like to know more about. Of course, this exhibit, Befitting Rutgers, focuses on New Jersey. I imagine that many of the attendees today, and some of you have reached out to me already, are drawn to the exhibit because of personal connections to the dozens of Jewish farming communities in central and southern New Jersey. That alone, I'm sure, is a story worth recalling and sharing with future generations. But as a historian and a proud member of a kibbutz farming community in Israel, and a farmer myself for decades, it's important to me that everyone in the audience and anyone who comes to the exhibit understands this. Whatever Jews accomplished on the land in New Jersey or in my kibbutz home in the Negev, these are part of a grand story of modern Jewish farming that began in the early 1800s, dated from sight not too long ago, and is now showing modest signs of rebirth. This agricultural thread connects many of us, wherever we live today, even if we haven't been aware of it until now. Although the exhibit itself is called Jewish Agriculturalism in the Garden State, we've constructed a kind of worldwide tour of Jewish farming. It covers a really long time span. The exhibit opens with a short reminder of our biblical farming heritage, both religious and cultural, which greatly diminished after the exile by Rome of Jews from the Holy Land in the first century of the Common Era. From there, the exhibit restarts in earnest in the early 1800s, when Jewish farming projects appeared out of nowhere in Eastern Europe and in North America. Later in the 1800s, these resettlement projects grew exponentially and spread further to South America and, of course, to Palestine with the arrival of the first Zionist pioneers in the 1880s. It's true that the only large-scale Jewish farming enterprises today remain only in Israel, and that often is taken by historians and others as a way to dismiss all other Jewish or chapters in Jewish farming in New Jersey or anywhere else. But I know, and I hope that this exhibit helps enlighten everyone else, that the very same agricultural miracle that indeed happened in Israel can only be understood and appreciated when we place it within the global picture of Jewish agriculturalism. That's what the exhibit tries to do. These agricultural points on the map of the Jewish world shared a lot, whether we're talking about New Jersey, Saskatchewan, the Argentine Pampas, the Ukrainian steppes, or Palestine. For one, they all began somewhere between the 1880s and the 1890s. Secondly, the farmers themselves were almost always migrants or refugees from Europe who were facing hardships in their homes. In many cases, neighbors or family members from the same towns, from the same neighborhoods, could wind up going from Poland or Russia into Jewish colonies on totally different continents. Thirdly, all of the projects, especially the more successful ones, and not all were successful, enjoyed generous support from Jewish philanthropists, mostly in the West: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Germany, London, Paris. Supporters of these projects, no matter where they were, really intended here to create a new kind of Jew by transforming impoverished, victimized town dwellers, sort of tevyas, if you would, from Fiddler on the Roof, into productive, strong, tanned farmers, men and women. The networks of colonies in each region almost always featured some kind of cooperative association, including marketing, purchasing, or even mutual credit. And in all cases, the colonies, again, no matter where they were, and those of you who grew up or are descendants of colonies in New Jersey know that they served as portals for relatively smooth integration of those families into their new home countries and societies. Almost lastly, what's a common thread is that it's almost impossible, as we also know on Israel's kibbutzim, to keep the second and the third generation of our children and grandchildren on the farm as farmers. It just really almost never works. And in fact, other than in Israel, all of these farming projects, no matter where they sprung up, all came to an end for a variety of circumstances that are explored on the exhibit somewhere between 1939 and the early 1960s. There are small bits of a renaissance lately in Jewish farming. For example, very close to the campus in New Brunswick, the Alliance Colony reboot. You can see many of these and experience many of these on the new generation page of the exhibit that Jackie will point out to you. Now, to give you a kind of first taste, an appetizer, we're going to look at a few pages in the exhibit that reveal some of the stories that constitute this grand history. These pages, and they're cherry-picked, also display the many kinds of materials you'll find on the exhibit. Here we see the opening page of the exhibit. And Jackie, you can go down a little bit. And we see here both text, and as we'll see here, we also have music. So Jackie, if you would give us about a minute of this, and I'll explain once it's over. Some of you may recognize this tune, and I'll briefly explain what it is.
We're going to do a song called Hey John Koya. Als men fort kan servestoppel, is net weit vom Simferoppel, dort is a stantie fahren. Wer darf suchen nahe klicken, is a stantie an Antikel, John. Here it is in English. When you go to Sevastopol, not so far from Simferopol, just you go a little farther on. For there's a little railroad depot known quite well by all the people, and it's called John Koya, John. The chorus, if you know it. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John, John. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John. Entfährt jeden auf mein Kasche, wo's mein Bruder, wo's a Brasche, es geht bei ihm der Traktor wie a Mann. Die Mummeleie bei der Kassilke, Bela mit der Molotilke, John Koya, John. In English now. Now, if you look for paradise, you'll see it there before your eyes. Stop your search and go no further on. For here we have a collective farm all run by husky Jewish arms, and it's called John Koya, John. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John. Wer sagt, dass jeden können nur handeln, essen, fette Joich mit Mandeln, noch nicht sein kein Arbeitsmann. Das können sagen nur die Sonnen, jeden schweigt sie an den Tonnen. Gitarre John. In English, well, Aunt Natasha drives the tractor, Grandma runs the cream extractor. While we work, we all can sing our song. Who says that Jews cannot be farmers? Spit in their eyes, who would so harm us? Tell them of John Koya, John. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John. Hey John Koya, hey John Billy, hey John Koya, John. Pete, when he had his sabbatical, which ended up as a Mondicle and a Tuesdicle because they were blacklisted.
Thank you. Okay, some of you may recognize this, and again, you can go back to the opening page to see it later. It is sung by the Travelers in 1960s, 1970s, 50s even, era folk troupe. They're singing a song that was popularized by Pete Seeger briefly, but its origins are in the steppes of Ukraine and as you can hear from the translation into English, celebrating Jewish agricultural colonization in the Soviet Union in between the world wars. There are many such pieces, items, music, and others throughout the exhibit. Next, we're going to look at the timeline. We've constructed here on the opening page a timeline of selected events in the modern lifetime of Jewish farming. It'll help you as you explore the exhibit and start to answer for yourself some questions about how did this all come to pass? And again, these are all things that later on today or in the coming days, you can go and take a look at. Next, we see a part of Jewish history that, you know, in some ways is a story of utter failure, but a failure that will bring in its wake great success. And this is the page dedicated to the Am Olam movement, or Am Olam in Yiddish, which were a group of idealistic Russian Jewish young people who decided in the 1880s and the 1890s to create a utopian network of Jewish communes throughout the United States, including in New Jersey. In fact, one of the few vestiges of those couple dozen failed utopian communes is in fact in the Alliance Colony, which in a way, it continues on to this day. Here too, you'll see a variety of materials, maps, blueprints, and photographs from those times and those locations. Next, another pillar of, and perhaps a bit unexpected, another pillar of Jewish farming, no matter where it happened, was the philanthropy and the ideology that supported it. And in this photo, we see Baron Maurice de Hirsch. And in fact, Jewish farming in the United States, particularly in New Jersey, owes much to this man who passed away in the 1890s, but in fact, it's still memorialized to this day in road signs, for example, here, taken from an intersection, sort of the main drag of Woodbine in southern New Jersey. And next, we have to take sort of to zoom out a little bit. We'll show you very briefly the page dedicated to North America, because in fact, there will be over time from the 1880s through until the 1960s, many dozens of Jewish agricultural colonies throughout the United States, centered mostly on the East Coast and on the West Coast of the United States. And I suppose one of the more entertaining parts of this, and things that perhaps many in the older attendees can connect to, is how Jewish farming manifests itself in the long term in all sorts of unexpected ways. And as you will see on the exhibit, in fact, what came to be known is the Borscht Belt, that network of resorts, Grossinger's, Kutcher's, the Nevele in the Catskills began much more modestly. In fact, as kinds of B&Bs and summer cottages in Jewish colonies in the counties in the lower Catskills. Over time, these same Jewish farmers were the bedrock of what became those mega resorts. And going from a zoom out, we can come to a zoom in of individual stories. For example, the personal story by Joseph Krauskopf from Philadelphia, and we'll see him here. Rabbi Krauskopf was a visionary of his time. And we see him here in this photo lecturing at Independence Hall, downtown Philadelphia in 1914. I suppose some of us, even if we're not aware of it, can give thanks to this man because he was instrumental in creating the third, not the first, not the second, but the third national Jewish farm school in the United States in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And we see here an advertisement. While it was still entirely a Jewish farming school, today it is now still a farm school, but long ago Jews became a minority up to a very almost non-existent part of the graduating classes there. But that here we just simply have an example of one man's story, and we have many of them threaded throughout in all the sections of the exhibit. Another kind of item that we have are voices. Voices. We've seen pictures, we've seen music. We also have testimonies. And one of these testimonies that we can find concentrated on this page called Voices from the Colonies, all taken from recordings made by the Rutgers Oral History Division of graduates of Rutgers or people directly connected to Rutgers. And we'll hear just a few seconds of a recording of Dr. Professor Hans Fischer, who was an emeritus of Rutgers University. Jackie, play that for us.
I always told my father that in terms of farming, he was born with 2 left hands because he really didn't, you know what it's like on a farm. There's something that has to be fixed every single day. You have to be a carpenter, you have to be a plumber, you have to be an electrician, you have to do all these things.
Okay, and as I said, we have the great pleasure of encountering many of these voices throughout the exhibit. This exhibit was a labor of love, I think, for myself, and I think I speak also for Jackie. We'll hear from her shortly. But labors of love very often are a collective effort. And Jackie, if you could show us the thank you page, I'd like to call out a number of people and institutions going beyond the Bildner Center, which of course made all of this possible. Okay, first, and as you can see here, the folks from the Bildner Center, of course, and from Rutgers University, were really instrumental in all of this. We also have the good fortune of including materials from current graduate students at Rutgers doing work about the colonies, and E. Kramer would be one of those. We also had a really unique cooperation with 2 institutions. The first is the Sam Aziz Museum of Woodbine Heritage, located, of course, in Woodbine, that is now affiliated with Stockton University. And Mrs. Jane Stark, who is the executive director there, was extremely generous in sharing materials with us from their collections, both visual and audio materials. So I'd like to thank them very much. Dr. Arthur Kieron, from the librarian of the Judaica collection at the University of Pennsylvania, was also extraordinarily generous with us in very difficult times. Keep in mind that the exhibit, as you see right now, it was constructed under conditions of COVID, where, in fact, Jackie and I have still never met to this day, and nor could we actually visit in any of these archives. So the people who cooperated with us here, including Sean Illingsworth from the Rutgers Oral History Archive, were really going above and beyond the call of duty to share materials with us. In addition, Richard Brotman shared his film collection with us, which you will see mostly on the Alliance page. Malia and William Levin, who are the founders of the Alliance Community Reboot, not only hosted myself and my wife and at their home in Alliance, but also opened up and really very rich parts of their own family history. You can find out more about that on the New Generations page. And finally, as you'll see, we didn't show them here, but there are a good number of video clips that were shot that I recorded on site in and around Alliance, in and around Woodbine. And Gillian Kay served as the videographer for that, as well as many of the still pictures of current day that we have throughout the exhibit. So with that, I will end my initial presentation and thank you, and I'll turn it back to Professor Sinkoff.
Thank you, Professor Dekel-Chen. So there are lots of comments and some questions in the chat, and I have some other questions that were sent to me on email. So I'm going to start broadly with this question of, can you hear me?
we want to go to Jackie now, I think.
Oh, okay, I apologize. What if?
No worries at all. Just briefly wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to come and look at our exhibit. This has been a labor intensive, but lots of love has gone into this project. Briefly about myself, before I began working with Jonathan, I was not aware of the rich Jewish farming history that was present in South Central New Jersey. I live in Hunterdon County, and I'm very familiar with the strong dichotomy that exists between the stereotypical factories and cities of northern New Jersey and the beautiful landscape that exists in most of the rest of the state. We are called the Garden State, after all, for a reason. But I wasn't aware that there was an initiative at the beginning of the 20th century to grow and develop the farming community and give opportunity to those who would otherwise have had few job prospects. My friends and family are now very much aware of this rich history after 7+ months of work on this project, and I'd like to thank them for their patience and cooperation with me. But when you dive into our exhibit, you'll find that towns like Roosevelt, New Jersey, Woodbine, and many others were developed in part by the generosity and community culture of Jewish philanthropists. And I'm very proud of the work that we've accomplished here. And I can't wait for all of you at home to explore and experience the rich history of Jewish farming in New Jersey and abroad. Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you so much, Jackie, and I'm sorry that we got a little tangled there.
No worries, no worries. No worries.
So there are a lot of questions. You know, you really just got a brief introduction of this really incredible site, and I want to emphasize something that Jonathan Dekel-Chen mentioned. You know, this whole project was conceived of that both Professor Dekel-Chen and Jackie would be able to have access to special collections at the libraries, to be able to travel to other holdings, and all of that was stopped by COVID-19. And it was extremely challenging because they had to work with very ultimately limited resources, but they put together a really dynamic site. And I think those of you who visit it will be really stimulated, and we'll talk more about how you can later contribute. But I have a couple of questions I think will illuminate some of the historical issues that perhaps were only touched upon. So Professor Dekel-Chen, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of global Jewish farming to Jewish nationalism, Jewish Zionism, these movements of the late 19th century? And then as a sidebar to that, how does this play out in the American context, which has not been the most fervent ideological?
Okay, well,
You're on. Are you were on and then you're off. Are you not there?
Yes, the internet connection out here in the middle of the desert sometimes is a little wonky. I think I heard, but I'll if I miss anything, you'll let me know. In terms of Jewish nationalism, there is a kind of narrative out there, without getting too sort of deep in the reeds of scholarly debate. The movement for Jewish farming worldwide is a part of a kind of Jewish Renaissance, starting in it really starts in the middle of the 1800s in Central Europe and then spread further east. And the idea is, generally speaking, that the Jews are tired of being victimized, and they're tired of having to inhabit the lower ranks of local economies. And the way to break out of this is both by education, but also productive work. And farming specifically. And that will take many forms. One branch of that movement of Jewish rebirth is Zionism, which is saying exactly the same thing. But Zionists believe, that the way that can only be achieved is by creating that rebirth in a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, no matter how hard that might be. Other branches of that common tree of Jewish nationalism believe that a Jewish people and Jewish strength and Jewish empowerment can be realized other places as well, but pretty much with the same formula, by education and productive work. And so if we look at, and we won't do it now, but when we look at that Am Olam or Am Olam page in the exhibit, it speaks exactly to that. As a result of the terrible pogroms that occur in the Russian Empire in 1882, there is a kind of fire lit in the Jewish world to respond to this. And two parallel movements get created in the same neighborhood, brother, sister, each joining a different part of that. One group is called Am Olam, a few hundred, as I said, long-haired, idealistic Jews who want to go farm the land in a free land in the United States, Canada, and they depart and they have their experience there. Their neighbors, their cousins from Odessa, from Kiev, from Vilna, have the same idea, but they want to do it in Palestine. And they're called something else. They don't call themselves Am Olam, or people of the world. They call themselves Chovavei Tzion, lovers of Zion. And they go to Palestine and found what we know today as places like Rishon LeZion and Gadera and Rehovot, and different trajectories from exactly the same source. They are two different kinds of Jewish nationalism. Over time, outside of the land of Israel, of course, the idea of nationalism really fades quickly. Rather, the idea is in New Jersey, when we're talking about New Jersey, or Petaluma in California, or Lipton in Saskatchewan, the idea is that when Jews come together, farm productively, empower themselves, there is real value in that intrinsically, and it also gives Jews a way to get out of the crowded cities and the tenements where clearly life is very difficult and bad things are happening. Jewish criminality is rampant, poverty is off the charts, disease and so forth. So different paths of the same essential idea.
So thank you. So I think one of the words that could be sum up some of this is a kind of utopianism in the best sense, both in terms of the Jewish national future, of transforming the Jews from an urban people to an agricultural people, emboldening and revivifying Jewish masculinity. All these things are sort of utopian projects, and the farmers are on the ground doing it. So one last thing about politics, there was someone in the chat who noticed or heard, and perhaps it's rumor, that in the post-war period, when those Jews in the Communist Party were seen as very suspect by both the American government and also by the Jewish community, actually, that some found refuge in these farm communities. Is that apocryphal? Is that something you've heard about?
It's not only not apocryphal, but we have a page on the exhibit dedicated to one of those colonies, in fact, called Roosevelt. It was renamed Roosevelt. It was called Jersey Homesteads initially. And in effect, it was a place of refuge for not necessarily Jewish communists fleeing McCarthyism, but more like Jewish socialists who were fairly unwanted in urban centers and found a decent living and fewer pressures by going and resettling out of the cities into a number of Jersey colonies. Roosevelt being a very distinct example, but there were others in Farmingdale and so on. It was quite well known, and sort of apocryphally, those who were chased by McCarthyism, Jewish communists in the 1950s, in fact, through family lore, I know that in fact were able to take refuge amongst Jewish farmers in these colonies, who themselves may have not have been communists at all, but out of Jewish solidarity gave refuge to people who were in flight.
So, so then related to that, what about, many people know that during World War II and immediately afterwards, there were, despite the closed doors of immigration, there were refugees who came from Europe. Was there an influx of at all of Jews fleeing either the predations of war or Nazism to the colonies? Was there like an uptick in the post-war period or not so?
That's a great question. There was, in fact, a significant uptick both before and after the war. During the war, no one, of course, could transit across the ocean. Before the war, and the people asking the question clearly know their history because, you know, in the night, basically from 1924 until the war breaks out in, let's say, 1940, there are increasing restrictions on immigration, generally speaking, from anywhere into the United States and other countries in the West. One of the few ways that Jews and anybody else could come to the United States, certainly from Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, was by being a trained farmer, by having a diploma or a certificate attesting from your home country, attesting to the fact that you were a trained farmer. And as a result, thousands of refugees before the war, mainly from Germany and Poland, arrived in colonies and were placed there by Jewish philanthropic organizations. All this is described in the exhibit, into existing colonies in Connecticut and in New York and in New Jersey, especially. And they were placed there and were really important to the continued sustainability of these colonies. After the war, starting about 1946, many thousands of displaced persons from Europe were, once they arrived in the United States, were placed by the Jewish Agricultural Society and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society also into Jewish colonies in those same places, also further west in California. The main idea here was that it would allow for these Jews to become self-supporting as quickly as possible, mostly by poultry farming of all things, because poultry farming, it doesn't require a lot of capital, it doesn't require much training, and if you just work hard and pay attention, you can make a pretty good living. And so this, again, this story was repeated after the war, and we, on the exhibit, we have both the big story and also individual examples of Holocaust survivors who find their way onto the farms again, mainly on the East Coast, a little bit on the West Coast.
So I know I'm going to ask a question that relates directly to your work. I mean, those of us who know your work see the interconnections, but between sort of global Jewish philanthropy and agriculturalism and immigration and migration. So there's a comment in the chat, and I'd like you to elaborate. I have my own opinions about it. We can have a little back and forth, but which is, you know, there's a perception, not to my mind completely accurate, that the more acculturated, socioeconomically advanced Jews of Central Europe, aka the German Jews, you know, were desperate to sort of distance themselves from their East European brethren and therefore set up these colonies. You know, any philanthropic project does have some paternalism built into it because there's a benefactor and there's a recipient. But can you sort of speak to the complexity of this relationship between Jewish philanthropists, and Baron de Hirsch being a notable one, but there are others, and the recipients? You know, how did that work? Can you, expand a little bit on that topic?
Sure. I mean, briefly.
Write a couple of books.
Yeah. Very briefly, these are kind of also forgotten stories of Jewish history, certainly in North America. There was historically a lot of tension between what we can generally call German-speaking Jews and Russian or Polish-speaking Jews. The German-speaking Jews tended to look down at the Russian and Polish-speaking Jews as sort of bumpkins, and in the other way around, the Russian and Polish-speaking Jews sort of looked at the Germans and said, these are just, arrogant rich men. But those kind of tensions existed in the Jewish world everywhere all the time. Class-based tensions. I mean, we don't like to talk about class. It's not, it's not so cool anymore. But in the end, you really can't get around it. Also internally, in the Jewish community. So yes, even in philanthropy, which is designed to help people, there is a bit of paternalism. There's no question in Jewish philanthropy as well. But the core idea here is to not get rid of these sort of uncomfortable, dirty East European Jews from the Lower East Side, by the the wealthier German Jews, who by that time were living in the Upper East Side and Upper West Side. And that wasn't the main motivator. It was a very minor and really a minor motivation here. They really wanted to help for all sorts of reasons. It was miserable. I mean, those of you who have had the opportunity to go visit the Tenement Museum, here's a free PR thing. I mean, you can really sense it. And for those of us who have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who told about it, the idea here was really one of relief, of constructing sustainable communities where Jews will be healthier. They really spoke about this. Will be healthier and less targeted by their neighbors, because they will be able to integrate into the fabric of those rural societies much more easily than they were integrating into the fabric of crowded, highly pressurized urban society. So I guess my answer to your question is both yes and no. Yes, there's paternalism, but is that necessarily bad news in its product? No, it's part of philanthropy, by the way. No matter where you look, whatever ethnicity you're talking about, it's almost inevitable.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think that a black and white image of philanthropy is just more complicated for many Jewish philanthropists. I mean, Baron de Hirsch and his wife, by the way, too, the Baroness de Hirsch, they felt sustained in their own Jewish identity by sharing their resources with less well-to-do Jews, and that was true in Europe as well. So, of course, they did have an image they wanted to cultivate. They wanted to transform their brethren, but it wasn't all negative. It's a complicated mix, and the recipients, some of them who later become writers, talk about that. They talk both about the beneficence of their philanthropic mentors and also the condescension. I mean, we see that, you know, for example, in the fiction of someone like Anzia Jezierska and other immigrant writers. I have a sort of a practical question, not about the site, but about material culture from the colonies. Were there any cookbooks produced by the colonists?
I have seen them, yes. I have seen cookbooks, and that was more in the colonies in the United States. Yes, there were, and I think I even know where they're located. They're held in archives. I know where they are, or in personal collections. So yes, I have seen them.
I wonder, the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe College has the largest collection, I think, of cookbooks. It would be cool to see if they have it. Yeah.
There will be. Nancy, I just want to leave enough time for the.
Yeah, no, I'm going to sum up. That was my.
Okay.
Go ahead.
For Jackie to be able to walk people through the exhibit.
Yeah. I'm looking at my time slot here. I just want to see if there's a couple of other more just pointed questions that we can get to. Some people are curious about how many people are left, kind of a numbers game. I think it's fair to say, and you said it too, this is a moment, it's a historical moment of productivizing Jews, and it's dovetails with immigration. But what happens is what happens, and it's happened in the state of Israel too, is that there isn't a longevity, a generational longevity, except on the kibbutz movement, to Jewish farming. And the pull of the city is very great, and also economically the pull of the city. I mean, agriculture today has to be subsidized everywhere, either through agribusiness or through philanthropic projects. So Jewish farming's decline fits with a much larger economic or socioeconomic transformation of how we produce food in this country and in the modern state of Israel. We all know that, right? The orchards are now high-tech Silicon Valley towers. Last question then about religion. Can you talk a little bit about the religious or traditional culture of our colonists, or lack therein? And did you find evidence of, quote, religious behaviors or observances? And that'll be the last question from the floor. Right.
Yeah, it is an interesting issue. Rabbis, generally speaking, rabbis back in the home communities in Eastern Europe were never enthusiastic about their congregants. And we're talking about Orthodox rabbis, because that's obviously the traditional sect in Eastern and Central Europe. they were never enthusiastic about Jewish farming resettlement. Their fear was, of course, that when Jews got far away from their insular religious communities controlled entirely by rabbis, that they would lose their religion. And for the most part, that didn't really happen. Yes, some rituals had to be adjusted at first because, you know, running a farm requires all sorts of things. You know, you do have to milk the cow on Saturday and feed the chickens. And holidays, not just in Israel, but also around the Jewish farming planet, holidays also began to kind of hybridize into celebrating more, not necessarily less of the Jewish ritual, but more of the agricultural implications. I mean, after all, the Jewish calendar, including the holidays, are basically all, they are reflections of the agricultural growing cycle. And so this would remain in place really until the colonies fade out or are destroyed, as I said, between 1939 and the 1960s. On the contrary, I think it's, and I can certainly say this in Eastern Europe, life in the colonies allowed for freer Jewish observance than in urban areas, because the regimes, which increasingly became more anti-religious, didn't really care about the countryside. And so you could just get away with all sorts of things in the countryside that you couldn't get away with in the larger cities. So in a way, the Jewish farming life in many, many parts of the world helped to prolong a more traditional kind of Jewish religious life, even though rabbis were no longer the primary communal authority. So orthodoxy, but without rabbis, or certainly not rabbis in charge by any stretch of the imagination. So it's a very interesting example. And by the way, the kibbutz, the religious kibbutz movement sustains that. They were in fact created. They created themselves by virtue of that global experience, this idea that we can be a religious, truly religious farming community, but we don't necessarily need a rabbi to tell us what to do or what not to do. And so that is absolutely an extension of things that happened throughout the Jewish world until the 1950s, 1960s.
I think that I would just nuance it a little bit. What Jewish farming allows is a reconnection with land, and so much of the biblical heritage and even the early rabbinic teachings are agriculturally based. And what happens if the diaspora and urbanization is that there's a whole, you know, people don't understand the Jewish calendar is based on what's going on in the sky, not what's going on in a book, right? And the same thing with thinking about, as you said, the Passover holiday and the harvests around Shavuot and Sukkot. These are agricultural-based holidays, and those who lived on the land, either in Israel or in colonies throughout the diaspora, can really embody a relationship to Jewish agriculturalism that's deeply, deeply seated, if I can pun here. So I want to go back to Jackie now, who's going to walk us through the exhibit and answer some of the technical, I hope, answer some of the technical questions and allow you yourselves to visit the site on your own. Thank you so much.
Hi again. So I'm going to be walking you through the virtual aspect of the exhibit. Let me share my screen with you. So this is a virtual exhibit. The link has been shared in the chat. So you will be able to access this on your own. You can explore it. This is the homepage. Up at the top, we have what's called the header menu. So these are our main topics that you can explore. You can click on these and it'll bring you to the page. And when you're on these pages, you'll notice on the right here, we have what we've referred to as an index. So it kind of reads like a book. We have the main chapters, if you will, here in a little bit of a bigger font, and the sub pages here below them. We recommend reading from top to bottom. Kind of helps to organize. Same thing with the pages, they read from top to bottom. And you just scroll down like a regular website and you find your information. Like I said, index here on the right. There's the search function here. There's a search bar here. It says search here in a little magnifying glass. We have a search function here. I like to use the search bar down at the bottom. It's just what I prefer. And I saw many of you mention in the comments, can I search for something? You can. So for example, if I search Woodbine and I search that, we're going to come up with a few pages here. We have the page Woodbine, the Rabbi page, and Jewish farming in the Garden State. So these are pages where the term Woodbine has been referred to. And then from here, you can click on them and read more about them. Our footer menu. So when you scroll all the way down to the bottom, again, you're going to see the main topics from the page. Our four main pillars: a world of Jewish farming, pillars of ancient and modern farming, Jewish farming in the Garden State, and new generations. We have where you can learn more about the exhibit, about myself, Jonathan. You can learn more. And then just a brief introduction to the Bildner Center website. And then it has been mentioned before, suggested English and language reading. That's going to be all the way down here at the bottom. So these are suggested readings from Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen about the website. All of these are related. Like it says at the top, anyone interested in further reading, explore the publications listed below. Most of these are easily available, can be found at college libraries, synagogue libraries, used bookstore, online marketplaces. And then if the rest of the team is ready, I can go into community contributions. So this is where we're looking for contributions from the community. We want to be very specific about what we're looking for. We're looking for physical materials of life cycle events for schools, farms, and everyday life that help tell the story of Jewish farming communities in New Jersey. These have to be submitted virtually. We cannot accept any physical items. They need to be high resolution. And if you are interested in submitting something, you can submit it through this portal. You hit Learn More, and this is going to take you to a portal on the Bildner Center website where you can put in your contact information and submit a file that you think would be relevant to the site. This portal has all of the information that you need. We are accepting submissions until January 31st of this upcoming year. And it gets more detailed of photographs of family life, digital images, scans, audio or video recording. And again, unfortunately, at this time, we cannot accept newspaper clippings, physical items at this time, because this is a virtual exhibit. We can only accept digital information. So just again, quickly to review, this is our main page. If you're interested in submitting something and you think that it would be relevant, here on this community contributions tab, you can submit things here through this Learn More button. If you feel that you need to get in contact any other way, our email is jewishfarming@sas.rutgers.edu, but it's pretty straightforward, community contributions, and it'll lead you to the portal.
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. That was great. I think no
Thank you.
more needs to be said. I would only add, I saw in the chat, someone, perhaps multiple people asked if this is going to be an ongoing project, and the short answer is yes. The idea here is through community contributions and additional research that we hope that we'll be able to do now that COVID is eased up a little bit. There's absolutely an intention here to expand the scope, but again, we'll never be encyclopedic. That I think the audience and everyone else needs to understand. But as materials come in and they can really contribute to what we're trying to do, we will be sharing them with the public. And so, yes, over time, you'll be seeing, I hope within the next few weeks, additions to the site, both in terms of pages, perhaps sections. That all remains to be seen, but that will happen with your help. And therefore, we're all very excited about it. And I will be remaining with the project for the next few months. And more on that as time goes forward. So we'll turn it back to here. Jackie, thank you so very much for all of your work for me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And from here, I'll turn it back to Professor Finkoff to wrap up.
So The chat says it all, how wonderful it has been to spend this hour with the two of you and with the work you did. And so I add my affirmation to that. I want to tell our public, just to be very clear, there is a delimited amount of time for you to digitize and scan and send your materials. It's until January of 2022. We don't have a staff to do this in perpetuity, which is frustrating because I know as an archival historian, there is more out there. It's just the way of the world. But if you do have materials that are appropriate, and you'll click on that community contributions button and you can scan it and submit it and upload it to the portal, it will be reviewed by our experts and they will add what is significant. There is some duplicative material, so you have to understand there's no guarantee that if you send something in that you're going to see it. And that's not because it's not worthy, it's just because any project like this is curated or selective. It's the nature of the beast. That's one. The second thing is that Professor Dekel-Chen is with us through the spring, but then he's got other things to do. Jackie was going to graduate. So this is a fantastically condensed short-term project of about 1.5 years, 2, and we're very proud of it and we'll continue to be so, but there will be an end point, and that's just, again, life as it is. So please do send in your materials, but do it sooner than later. Don't wait till March and April, because you'll get I'm sorry, the site is closed, and we just have to do it that way. So I want to thank again the audience, great audience. We see all 250 plus of you. And I'm going to thank Jackie Hankert and Dr. Jonathan Dekel-Chen. And I want to tell our public, we have, of course, many other things going on at the Bildner Center. The Rutgers Jewish Film Festival goes live on November 7th through the 21st, celebrating Jewish history, culture, and identity. We have award-winning international dramas and documentaries, including many acclaimed films from Israel. And this year's festival is a hybrid model. Again, we're still in COVID land. So there are some in-person events, but there are many virtual talks and speakers. So please check out the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival website. We are sponsoring another great mini course. I say this because some of you may have attended Professor Dekel-Chen's mini course last year on the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And we have a course that is going to be taught by Professor Emerita Anita Norwich on women in Yiddish literature. That's 3 Monday nights starting November 29th. And then we have an in-person event. I really even can't believe I'm saying that, an in-person event with Professor Leah Garrett of Hunter College, who has a new book called Ex-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. And I hope I can welcome you both virtually and in person to these events. Just check out the Rutgers, the Bildner Center website, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much for attending.